Bluegrass Airport is an American aviation story. Its remarkable history has been chronicled through a series of oral history interviews. We are speaking with Dr. George Gumbert, who served on the Lexington-Fayette Urban County Airport Board for 22 years and is co-founder of the Aviation Museum of Kentucky. George, do you remember when you first realized you wanted to fly?
Yes, I was about 5 years old, I guess. I grew up in Richmond, Kentucky, where I was born, and I remember playing out in the front yard, and I heard this noise overhead, and I looked up, and there was an airplane. It was some kind of a military biplane, I'm pretty sure, or a trainer biplane, 4 wings, and I watched it go over, and I was just really taken by that, and I thought, one of these days, I'm going to do that.
How old were you when you first went up in an airplane?
I was 16 when I took my first ride, and that was also my first flying lesson, and that was at Cool Meadow Airport here in Lexington. And I didn't tell my parents about it, but I managed to get in about 3 or 4 hours of training until they found out about it, and that put an end to that because they didn't believe in flying very much. My father had been on a trip, not a trip, but a local flight, and this idiot tried to scare him to death by doing all these aerobatics, and that ruined a lot of people as far as their future thoughts about flying.
Talk about your parents' reaction to you learning to fly.
They didn't know about it. And we'd hitchhike to Lexington and hitchhike out to Cool Meadow Airport, and anytime you could rake up to $4 or $6 for an hour's flight, fuel was pretty cheap. Then they didn't ask any questions. They were nice people and responsible instructors. But if you had a few bucks to spend, they were glad to have you because business wasn't too good at that time. There were 3 or 4 of us from Richmond who drove over. I didn't have a car then available, but we would drive over, and almost always on Sunday, because they had jobs working on the pipeline which was being built through here at that time as part of the war effort.
Who were your mentors in aviation?
Well, several of my friends my age would get together and talk about flying, and we'd share what knowledge we had. And there was a automobile dealer in Richmond, Ernest Woods, who had a little Cub and a little airstrip out toward Irvin. And he had air shows, if you could call them that. He had air shows every weekend, weather permitting, and we'd get our buddies to drive us out there. I never did get to go for a flight. Some of them did, but that was my first contact and my first time to get up close to a real airplane, which was an early Piper Cub.
Would you talk about the early airstrips in Lexington?
Hollyfield was named for a Dr. Halley, H-A-L-L-E-Y, who lived and owned the farm, which is now Meadowthorpe subdivision. And he got interested in aviation, and they asked him if they could start landing out there, and within a year or two they'd put up a rather primitive wooden hangar, and they could keep an airplane or 2 in there. And what was important about Hollyfield is that that's where Lindbergh first landed in Lexington in 1924. Of course, that was after his transatlantic flight. And he brought in several friends and a brother of Dr. Halley's, who gave them permission to land.
Tell us about Charles Lindbergh.
Well, he came, as I said, to visit the brother here, who was the brother of his attorney during the Lindbergh kidnapping trial, which was widespread news. And he stayed 1 or 2 nights. This was real. He didn't like to advertise where he was going. He didn't tell people where he was going because the crowds were just, he attracted such crowds that it was hard to manage and complicated his visit. So He flew in without any notice, but by the time he left 2 days later, I think it was 2 days later, the crowd was immense, and they respected him and they gave him clearance. But the field was very short, certainly by today's standards. He was flying a Ryan monoplane very similar to the Spirit of St. Louis that had been modified to accommodate 5 people, I think. So it was heavily loaded, and that was one reason that he had a little trouble getting off the ground from this short field. But it was then that he complained about the field being so short and said we needed a bigger airport. Yes, Charles Lindbergh became an instant international hero. Prior to this flight, he was among several other people who were trying to get ready to do the first transatlantic flight, and he developed a group of backers, sponsors in St. Louis area, and they bought this airplane, and he flew it from California to the east and stopped in St. Louis to see them, and still a fairly unknown person. And but he was a very shy and secretive person anyway, so they kept it pretty quiet, and then his next stop was up east when he was going to really make final preparations for the transatlantic flight. Yes, airmail at that time was all done at night, and it was done without the benefit of radios, very little, if any, guidance from the ground. The story was that farmers along the route would light bonfires at night for these pilots to use as checkpoints. And then later, in the first year or so, they got electric flare lights that they could turn on to light the airway about every 15 miles. But if the weather was bad, as it frequently was, they'd have to fly from light and hold a compass heading when they flew very low. There were no radio aids, as I said, and if they missed a light every 15 minutes, they'd have to turn around and go back and find the previous one and try it again. Lindbergh, I think, bailed out 4 times. His route was St. Louis up to Chicago area, and he had to bail out at night because he was caught up in the weather, and the weather was too low for him to attempt a landing. So he just got down as low as he could and bailed out and let the plane crash, and they went out and got the mail out of the crashed airplane. But he survived all 4 of the bailout flights, obviously.
Would you compare Hollyfield and Cool Meadow?
Well, as far as the local airports, Hollyfield was a very short field because it was just a farm. It had not been, there were no improvements in the way of runway. So, and here Lindbergh comes in this airplane with 5 people in it, heavily loaded, so that means a longer takeoff run. And that's why he said it was too short, and it took a skilled aviator to successfully use Hollyfield with a big load like that. Now, at Cool Meadow, there was adequate length, but no pavements, no pavement runways, and it was mainly for light aircraft, small aircraft training, but DC-3s could land there if they were not heavily loaded.
George, what type of airplane did you learn to fly?
First airplane I rode in, I learned to fly in, that was a Piper Cub, just almost identical to the existing Piper Cubs of today. There are Cubs flying that are 30 or 40, maybe even 50 years old. Very simple, basic, honest airplanes produced by the Piper Company up in Pennsylvania. And later I got into larger, more powerful airplanes, but the Cub was all we needed to learn to fly and learn to navigate because it was just physical activity, practically no radio work involved.
When you learned to fly, was radar in use at that time?
You must remember that radar was begun around busy airports, Cincinnati, New York, Cleveland, and the radar was effective only for just a few miles, 25, 30 miles away, and smaller airports could not justify radar because well, it wasn't being produced or financed for smaller airports, and air travel then was not nearly what it would be within the next 10 years. So that's why radar was late coming to Lexington. We really didn't need it. We could have used it, but there was no demand for it, I'll put it that way.
And tell us about the early days of Bluegrass Field.
Well, Bluegrass Field was built during the last part of World War II by the federal government, and there was nothing here except the 3 runways. They were in triangular fashion, which was the style then and still is. So the war was coming to an end, and even though this airport had finished runways, which the military used for training on cross-country flights, the airport didn't really get developed commercially until after World War II.
What personal aviation achievement stands out for you?
Well, everything I did gave me a great sense of satisfaction because it was all exciting, and still is for that matter. But I didn't have any great accomplishments that would be written up in the record books. One of my accomplishments that I'm proud of was my continued involvement in Bluegrass Airport, development of it, and I think I was on the board for 22 years and 20 years as chairman, and we really worked at it back in those days, and we had a good thing going here. We were up to date as far as the technology in airports was concerned, and I'm proud of that. I had some exciting times. I used my airplane for, I was team physician at UK football for about 20-something years, and I used the plane to go to games that were nearby or not too far away, although we could usually make a 3-day trip out of Baton Rouge, which meant a stop overnight in New Orleans for some entertainment. But the main thing and I had some fun shipping this airplane to Europe. I'll tell you about that a little later. My brother-in-law was a Piper Cub pilot in World War II. He was an observer and flew little Piper Cubs and was involved in the Normandy invasion in June of 1944. And those little guys were not armed, and they had to fly low to spot for artillery to tell them where their artillery fire was hitting the ground. See, the advantage of that was original artillery started before the Civil War, but they could only direct their fire as far as they could really see. But when aircraft started being used, then they could fly at distances and direct the fire to be changed as necessary when the people firing the guns couldn't see where their fire was going. So my brother-in-law had been involved in the Normandy invasion, as I said, and he landed on D+3, and that was a terrible, costly time for our armed forces in a few of the beaches. So he received the Silver Star for some expert direction of artillery fire, which saved a bunch of troops, and then he flew over in little Cub airplanes and dropped blood plasma when this unit was surrounded, and that was what he got the Silver Star for. I'm very proud of him for that.
Please. Tell us about shipping your Piper Cub to England.
Well, Fred Madden, my brother-in-law, the pilot, had always talked about wanting to go back to Normandy, where he'd landed and where he had fought in this little Cub airplane for 3 months after the invasion, but he never did it. And so when we got this chance to get this little World War II Cub, they're rather rare. They didn't bring any home from Europe or the Pacific because they were rather flimsy airplanes, if you'll pardon the expression, and so they didn't bother to bring them back. They gave them away or junked them. But we thought we got to go back for Fred, and we fixed this Cub up with original war paint on it, and we shipped it to Europe. And I'd been to Europe several times. My wife and I had become acquainted with some Cub pilots over there in England, and so we shipped the airplane to them in a crate, and they had it back together by the time we got there about 6 weeks later. And we flew around England in it, and we flew to Normandy across the English Channel just for Fred. And that was one of our proud moments. Fred didn't go back, but we went back for him.
Talk about some of the issues that came up while you were on the Lexington-Fayette County Airport Board.
One of the most difficult was selecting the proper way, the practical way of enlarging the airport, increasing the runway length, which we accomplished several times while I was a chairman of the board. And that was because of the terrain. There was a lot of public input, and people in the surrounding, there were a lot of differences in opinion as to what was proper and good. And so because any changes involved taking some land that didn't belong to us and buying it and building airport runways on it. One of the difficult problems was selecting the proper way to enlarge the airport, and there was a lot of public opinion and several different plans that we had. So we wound up enlarging the airport by putting a second runway just for small planes. We call it a general aviation runway. We would have preferred to have two long parallel runways, but that wasn't feasible, and we couldn't justify it. And there was a lot of opposition to it. But that was one of the things we accomplished, is improving the airport, giving it greater capacity, which was important as aviation grew. Yes, now the airport board's responsibility was to accommodate the needs of the public as far as air travel was concerned. And through the time I was on the board, we went from almost totally propeller-driven airliners and business airplanes to turboprops and jets. And when we got into jets, that was a different requirement. You needed longer runways for adequate safety. And so the board had to make decisions to accommodate these new needs for safety and passenger hauling capability. And that was one of the big tasks that we faced over a number of years. The thing we did was to lengthen the runway a couple of times until the main runway, and that became, further lengthening became not feasible. So we had to do other things to accommodate the needs of the airlines.
Would you talk about when the Concorde and larger jets came to Bluegrass Airport?
Yes, the main thing you're speaking of is the Supersonic Transport, which was a British-French airplane, and it was the first airplane of its type anywhere in the world. It needed more runway, and it needed wider runways. I believe it was partly a Chamber of Commerce promotion, but anyway, a supersonic jet did come to Lexington from Europe and took a load of people to Europe. They made a stop up in the northeastern U.S., New England, I believe, to refuel because those planes used lots of fuel. And then they went on to Europe. So we did have one supersonic jet airplane, and that created quite a lot of excitement around here. A lot of us got to go aboard the plane. We didn't get to fly on it because it carried only about 100 people, and the publicity of that helped promote Bluegrass Airport. For years, airport runways have been constructed to the strength level or the length level that they're going to be used most frequently. And for an airport that had maybe 1 or 2 jets or 1 or 2 large planes per day, you wouldn't need to have the same strength of pavement because it wasn't going to have all that impact. But if you had 50 flights a day or something like that, or you were flying regularly with heavy loads, you would need more length of the runway so they could make a safe takeoff and landing. And so we did not have that problem here because early on we had very few jets landing. Then as that use by heavier planes and more frequent planes occurred, we thickened the runway and strengthened it and lengthened it several times. So we were able to keep up with the demand, you might say.
Was keeping up with technology or lighting ever a problem?
Runway lighting was not a problem. The only thing I remember when the SST was here and maybe when the 747 landed, the outboard jets, the number 1 and number 4 engine, were out so far that they were out over the edge of the pavement, and they threw up some rocks that broke out landing lights, but that was quickly repaired. And that was about the only thing. One big improvement was improved approach lights, that is, lights out off of the approach and departure end of the main runway. And those were regularly upgraded as that technology improved. So that helped us have lower approach minimums for night landings and so forth.
Talk about private aviation.
All visiting aircraft that are separate from airline activity are very adequately taken care of, accommodated by our fixed-based operator, FBO we call them, the fixed-based operator, which is TAC Air, TAC-AIRE. And they're specialists at what they do. They handle it well. And if you just visit their facility, which is a beautifully constructed new facility on the other side of the airport, you'd be impressed with the quality of operation that they have going.
How does the general aviation side interact with the overall airport operation?
The only interaction is that they pay their bills on time, and they do. We could always use a few more general aviation hangars, and there are plans now for additional general aviation hangars to be built over on the western side of the airport. That construction has not been planned to the final degree yet, but it will take place and will take care of the needs of general aviation aircraft.
Talk about the airport's relationship with the city.
I would like to say that we always got good support from the city government for improvements that were needed, because you see, most of these things had funding for the majority of the work from the federal government. And if we could satisfy the FAA that we needed something, and they would work it into their budget. So that was helpful. The local share was generally a small portion of our budget, and it didn't cause any real problem. And I was always pleased during my entire 22 years on the airport board to feel that I was involved with a group of interested people who had the betterment of Bluegrass Airport at heart and would work very hard to achieve what was needed to keep us up to date with technological development.
Talk about the construction of the new terminal.
You know, there were some people that didn't think we needed to enlarge the terminal building. And I always think back to a special board meeting that we called, And that was before I became chairman. I was a regular board member then. But a local banker, Mr. Garvis Kincaid, who was always very pro-airport, boy, he was really a supporter of Bluegrass Field. And he called all the bankers in town together and said, now look, we're going to have to build a new terminal building. It's been thought out and recommended, and we're going to have to do it. And I want all the banks to go together to give some preliminary financing. You'll get your money back, but I want all the banks to go together and contribute according to their deposits, their share of what it's going to take to get this project started. And he outlined what it was going to cost. And I never will forget this. One of the bankers, one of the smaller banks, who was owned by a man and his son, stood there. He got up and he said, we don't need a new airport terminal. I'm not going to participate. He got up and walked out. Just walked out. Said, you guys are spending money you don't need to spend. And we thought, what in the world's the matter with this guy? And so Kincaid said, it's all right, let him go. We don't need him. We'll do without him. The rest of us will take care of it. And they did take care of the early financing for planning and so forth. And there was a lot of work to be done to properly plan the new airport terminal, its location, its capacity, and so forth. And we got that done. It wasn't easy, but it took a lot of discussion. We hired a designer from Atlanta, I believe, and some of the local people were involved also. But we felt like we did a good job with the first new terminal that was built, and then the tearing down of the old terminal. I've got a picture of them side by side. There's about half the old terminal gone and the new terminal in operation. It's a very nostalgic picture. But we got the job done.
Talk about the old days at Bluegrass Field.
The change was tremendous when you compare our old airport terminal and airport activity to what we have now and what you see all over the country. Air travel was not nearly as commonly used by people then. And in the years after we built this new terminal, we more than doubled our passenger loading activity. So we were really past due in getting our new terminal built. We had needed it for quite a while, but it was always a matter of how to finance it and so forth. So in the early days, as we said, people dressed up to take an airline trip, and I mean really dressed up, ladies and gentlemen. And now it's quite different. As the airline industry grew and they got more modern airplanes and their capacity for passengers increased by demand, the air travel changed considerably. Looking back and comparing the old type of air travel and the accommodations available then versus the more modern era, it was an entirely different picture. In Lexington, in the early days, baggage handling was a different matter, and it wasn't even in the terminal building. They didn't have enough room for it, so they checked the baggage in and checked it out during busy hours to a big thing outside on each side of the door that looked like a cattle feed trough. And you'd check your luggage in there or pick it up when you were ready to leave the airport. And so this all changed. It was a family affair to take someone out to the airport to watch them leave or to watch them arrive and welcome them home. So this all changed with the increase in air travel and the use of the new terminal.
How did security and safety measures change over the years?
In comparing the activity at Bluegrass Airport with the old terminal and air travel of that era with the later jet travel and our passenger loads increasing, our passenger volume greatly increasing. There was all difference in the world. In the old days, kids and family would come out to see Dad off on a business trip or welcome Dad and Mom home from a vacation. It was a family affair, and you could circulate. You could even walk out, meet them almost as they got off the airplane, but out on the apron. And that all changed, of course, with more flights and more and larger passenger loads. So that was the main thing. Our passenger loadings here, I think I said, more than doubled from the time I came on the board until late in my service out here. And you had to take care of the people safely and rapidly and properly. The FAA had begun to develop some improved safety measures around the country, and they let it be known they would consider Lexington as a training center for regional employees, that is, employees of regional airlines. And of course we went for that, and we showed them some land that they could have. And to make the short story of it, they did build a fire training center on the airport, and it's still in operation. And people are sent here from airports all around the state and even from out of state to receive periodic training in upgrades and safety for airline activity. So we encouraged that, and we were very pleased that it is still in operation on Bluegrass after all these years.
Lengthening the runway seemed to be an ongoing process.
Well, we mentioned it several times, and there were several lengthening procedures through the years. And every time we got a chance to justify a lengthening of the runway, we did it. We found a way to do it. And it got to the point that at the far end of the runway 22, it was such a big fill and so expensive that it couldn't be done. But we also lengthened the approach end of 22, I believe, on at least one occasion. And that's where we are today. We think we're adequate, and the airlines accommodate their loads and their performances to the capacity that the runway has. Almost always it involves an overlay of the existing runway as well, because heavier planes are going to come in, and the number of heavier airplanes will increase, and that, of course, is why you need a runway with more capacity for an increased number of landings.
Tell us about your involvement with University of Kentucky football.
Yes, well, we help with recruiting. We would go into Ohio or Tennessee or someplace like that and bring prospective signees, prospective athletes to the campus for a weekend. And when we got ready to build the new stadium, we took Bernie Shively and several university officials to larger towns who had much larger stadiums or new stadiums, so that they could check out what they had and have a better idea of what we needed. We were pretty low in capacity compared with the rest of the Southeastern Conference for a while, but we're in pretty good shape now.
Were you involved with University of Kentucky basketball?
A little bit, not much. We never did take Coach Rupp with us, but he did fly a good bit on recruiting, I know, and so whatever was needed was what we helped out with. The airport has always been able to accommodate sports fans and the travel of our team away activities, and this is up to the fixed-based operators. It doesn't interfere with airline activity at all and is easily worked into the schedule to not interfere with airline activity. There are a certain number of sports fans who fly in for these things, and we welcome them, try to take good care of them, and generally they're quite satisfied. And the volume of it never interfered with normal airport operations. We easily accommodated it. We knew exactly when these things were going to happen, and our people were prepared to deal with it.
Do you recall any celebrities who came through the airport?
We've had a lot of famous people here, and most of them arrive and depart at Bluegrass Airport. My biggest thrill, the biggest thrill for my late wife and me, was twice being able to bid Queen Elizabeth farewell when she was here for her thoroughbred activities, mainly to visit Keeneland and so forth. But to get to meet and shake hands with Queen of England twice is something that I never dreamed we would be able to do, but it happened. And we've had presidents here, we've had all sorts of other dignitaries, and it just seems to grow and grow. A lot of it related to the thoroughbred industry and the standard bred industry. So we can be thankful, especially that we are the location as far as world activity is concerned for thoroughbred and standard bred horses.
Do you remember when Liz Taylor visited?
Yes, I do, because that movie was shot in Danville, Kentucky, and Liz Taylor, and I've forgotten who her co-star is. Who cares what an ugly old guy when you got Liz Taylor around to admire? But I didn't get to meet her, but we saw her, and she was a delightful guest while she was here making that movie.
Any other luminaries you recall?
Another person especially worthy of mention is a longtime member of our organization, Story Musgrave. And those of you who've kept up with space activity realize he's been in space 3 times. He repaired the Hubble telescope, and he's now graduated. Now, of course, all of NASA flights have been cut back or canceled, but Story had an outstanding record of service to our country in space activity. He started here, as I said, when he was a student at UK, before he really learned to fly. And he is now doing private work and has a record that will compare with anyone's record as far as contributions to space activity is concerned.
Talk about co-founding the Aviation Museum of Kentucky.
I've always been interested in aviation, as I previously mentioned, and you just automatically get involved in aviation history, reading about it, who did what was invented, what was produced in the way of aviation activity and equipment, both for airlines and private flyers. So I was fortunate. My wife, who was from Kentucky, was an airline hostess for 4 years. Her sister was a hostess for 7 years. They were both Capital Airlines, and they were based in Washington, D.C., and that Capital, of course, united with, or joined with, Capital, of course, became part of United Airlines when they merged. But I was fortunate in that my wife was excited and liked aviation as well as I did. And during my 4 years of training here in orthopedic surgery, I was on 36 hours and off 12. Well, that 12 hours we'd often spend at the airport, and we'd sit there in the old Burmer Flying Service concrete pad and watch planes take off and land. And we would do what we call a hangar fly, talking about aviation, anything about aviation. And finally, Wendell Murphy and I got together and said, look, we've got We've got a couple of dozen people here who are all interested in what we're interested in, the fun part of aviation and the history part of aviation. Why don't we get a club together and start meeting? Well, to make a long story short, we did start a club, and we didn't have a museum building then. We called it the Aviation History Roundtable, patterned after the Civil War Roundtable that was here. So we wrote out a notice to everybody who's interested in starting a group like this, sent them a postcard, and we had about 80 or 90 people the first time. And we started inviting guest speakers. I was involved at Dayton with the National Aviation Hall of Fame, and I met a lot of folks up there, and got speakers to come down here at no cost to us. And a lot of these were World War II heroes and famous flyers of other times. So we started meeting every 3 months, and that's really what got our organization started. We as I said, we had programs regularly, and we'd have a dinner with it, and usually we'd pay the people's travel to and from, but we didn't have any money for anything else. So this is what got started at that early date. And we always knew we would want a museum, and that's another story of how a museum became available to us. But that's what got us started, and this went on for about 7 or 8 years before we could even think about an aviation museum. We finally got enough money together that we could make a down payment on a building. You see, the airport board owns all the airport land. Nobody owns any land on the airport except the board, but there are some privately owned buildings. So we scraped up enough money, you might say, to make a down payment on a hangar that was already in existence, and we bought it from a company that wanted to move out. So we said we were going to call it the Aviation Museum of Kentucky, and it was going to be dedicated and we got the legislature in Frankfort to designate us as the official Aviation Museum of Kentucky. And we opened it in April of 1995, and for our first official group to meet, we were able to, I had met some of the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders, and everybody knows who the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders were. They practically ended the war single-handedly, and I met them at Dayton and interested them in coming to Lexington for their annual meeting in April of 1995. So we did it, and they met here, and it was a wonderful experience to have this first official meeting of the Aviation Museum of Kentucky with guest speakers of, I think we had 26 Tokyo Raiders. There were only 80 to start with. You remember 16 planes took off from a carrier, bombed Japan, flew into China, and most of them survived. And it was a total surprise and helped end the war right quick. So anyway, that's how the museum got started, and we all brought in our collections. Several of us had antique airplanes, and we got everything we could exhibit, and we put it in this hangar, which is now still, it's owned by somebody else. That was the way we acquired our first hangar, and it still stands. It has a different occupant now when we moved to our current hangar, which is more than twice as large. So we've been an aviation museum since April 1995, and we've gotten bigger. We haven't gotten any richer, but we're having a lot of fun. We have quarterly meetings, and they all deal with some aspect of aviation history, and we've had wide participation by a lot of the service clubs here in Lexington, and we have lots of school kids, which is our main goal, is to teach young people what aviation is all about, not just being a pilot, but teaching them what aviation has done for the country, transportation, business, and all the ancillary activities that go along with aviation, both private and airline. And it might interest you to know that there are more than 3 times as many business airplanes right now as there are airline airplanes. It's widely used by business.
Would you talk about other regional airports around Lexington?
I should mention Georgetown Airport. That originally was at a different location, and it was very short, not the safest airport to use. There were a number of accidents there. When I was in orthopedic surgery here, I took care of a couple of people who were in a bad accident over there because of the shortness of the runway, and they didn't survive. But Georgetown wanted a larger airport, and at that time the need was obvious that we needed another airport to accommodate general aviation, because Lexington was temporarily sort of stalled and no more development was going on. So the Georgetown Airport location was selected. The Georgetown Airport Board asked Bluegrass Airport Board, where I was, if we would work with them and advise them. So they appointed 3 of us from Lexington to work with Georgetown, 3 people, and we worked out an airport which was now a fine, well-paved airport. It's grown. There are about 8 or 10 large hangars for multiple airplanes, and it has served to relieve some of the pressure on Bluegrass Airport, because a lot of smaller planes are based there that would be here and would be a problem in trying to accommodate them. Yes, none in Fayette County except one private strip that's not very widely used. There is a nice airport at Richmond, between Richmond and Berea, and it accommodates general aviation, and it can handle even DC-3 size airline, but they don't use it regularly. It's mostly general aviation. And there are a few others, but that's basically it. Of course, there's a fine airport at Frankfort, Kentucky. Been there for years. The state uses it for their aircraft, and there are quite a few private aircraft based there. No airline activity.
Can you speak to the challenges of being on the airport board?
Probably the greatest overall challenge that any of us on the board faced through the years was balancing what we knew to be the needs and the future needs of the airport, all aspects of airport, airline, private, air cargo, and so forth. The future needs of the airport as compared with the public's attitude, a segment of the public's attitude that would resist change, especially if those changes would make demands on their own personal property. And so we managed to work them out pretty well. It took time and compromises, but by engaging the ideas and comments through discussion with everyone, we were able to work out a compromise that did a pretty good job. These compromises would be certainly remuneration to the people whose land was going to be affected or taken, and that was the main thing. And even in the last few years since I've been on the board, as you know, the airport has expanded a good bit to the west, and they have managed to work out land acquisition that will open up a new area for general aviation over on the west side of the airport.
Was there a challenge transporting horses?
It didn't really involve too much of a challenge because the horses don't complain. But Tex Sutton, who was our first and for many years our only person in the business of transporting horses, was very cooperative, and those flights didn't cause any problem. Tex was one of the earlier people to send horses or bring horses in from Japan, England, and continental Europe. So he worked it out, and it's been a very popular and useful capability that we have had here through the years to take care of this need to transport valuable horses. Other airports handle it pretty well, I think. The other areas around the country use the same transportation methods and so forth, and it doesn't require a large fleet of airplanes because these flights are maybe weeks apart, and but transportation of horses and other livestock, but mainly horses, is big business, and it's very common throughout the United States, and they get the job done.
Tell us about Keeneland and the airport.
Well, in the early days, people would fly into the races, and the airport would let them park over near the Versailles Road walk-through gate. They'd land and taxi over there. The tower would direct them. They knew where to go, and they would walk across the road and be in Keeneland, and after the race, they were out and gone back home. So it was fairly common. It's less common nowadays, but the transport of horses has been an important part of our capability here.
We understand that there was a road named for you recently.
Yes, well, I won't say much about it except that I was thrilled and greatly honored. It's an access road to what will be the new general aviation, that is non-airline aviation area for hangars on the airport. And it's off of Versailles Road on the Versailles side of the airport. And I was surprised, flattered, and very honored that they chose to name that Gumbert Road.
Tell us more about your family's interest in aviation.
I think I did get them interested. My wife, already being an airline hostess for 4 years and flown all over the world, it took a bit of getting used to for her to be in small aircraft, but she eventually soloed and got her own private license and had her own little puddle jumper and loved it. And my two children, Mary, who lives here, and George, who is in Bowling Green, Kentucky, both have private licenses, and they grew up in the back seat of our airplane, visiting relatives and so forth in Boston and friends in Denver, and so they're great air travelers.